Okay, you guys, today's lesson will be about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So you guys want to take some careful notes here because there are going to be a lot of dates and facts I'm going to be covering here. And then if you guys have questions, don't forget, just write them down, and then we'll discuss those questions that you have as soon as we get back to class. Okay, here we go. So let's do a quick little review. Our last lesson was about yellow peril. I want to go over and make sure that we cover some of the pull factors for why the Chinese start to arrive in such large numbers to the United States, therefore causing yellow peril, this panic about the Chinese basically taking over the United States. So remember, the very first major event that will happen here in the U.S. is when gold is discovered in 1848. We have the gold rush, and so tons of Chinese will arrive from China here into California in search of gold, and also to take on some of these business opportunities that come about once gold is discovered. The second thing is something I didn't mention earlier, but it's something I thought that was worth talking about, and that was in 1852, Chinese laborers were hired to come into Hawaii to work on U.S. plantations, specifically for harvesting coffee and sugarcane and pineapple and banana. So it's the first time we start to see Chinese immigrants arriving in Hawaii before it's a state. It's even before the United States turns it into a territory. But we start to have some early immigration there, and eventually those Chinese immigrants in Hawaii will make their way to the mainland here in California. Then in 1865, the other big event that we've been talking about is the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, where the Central Pacific Railroad Company will hire Chinese laborers to build the western half of the railroad, and that's probably the single largest project that's given to the Chinese during the 19th century. And eventually we get to 1868 with the Burlingame Treaty, which essentially opened doors, normalizing a more friendly relationship with China, opening our gates to the Chinese, and that's where we start to see a massive flow of immigrants from China. Then you start to get this idea of yellow peril, where the Chinese are basically going to bring down the United States, that somehow they're going to cause the degradation of our economy and our society and our morals. And so at this point, the Chinese will be described as teeming hordes. You're talking about 15,000 Chinese immigrants coming per year in the 1870s. It's a number that's pretty astounding for this time period. And you're talking about people that are virtually an unknown group. And so it's a very foreign and alien group that start to flood into the United States. And I'm sure it didn't look like this, but this is sort of what the fear was as far as what they thought, what America thought it would be when the Chinese would arrive. Okay, that's actually a video of a bunch of crazy people trying to get into a store on Black Friday. I think someone got trampled to death. Okay, I'm going to share with you guys a couple of early laws and court cases that will impact the Chinese. These are some of the precursors to the eventual big act that we'll talk about, the Exclusion Act of 1882. And you're going to have a more detailed list of these laws and cases in a handout that I've already put together and posted online for you. Okay, but it's just a couple of things to share. One of the earliest laws to pass was known as the Foreign Miners Tax back in 1850, and this is right when the gold rush was beginning. So when the Chinese started to arrive, the United States actually levied this. They created this law that would impose a tax on all foreigners who came during the gold rush. And any time they discovered gold, a certain percentage of that gold would be given as tax to the United States. So the problem was that this foreign miners tax was only enforced on the Chinese, and obviously it was because they look completely different. when you had a bunch of Irish arriving to do the same thing, they were pretty much left alone and weren't forced to have to pay this tax, but the Chinese were. And in the end, I don't remember the exact numbers, but the amount of money that was collected from all the gold that was discovered through this tax ended up being in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And in today's time, we're talking about money that's probably worth in the billions of dollars. In 1854, there was a court case called People versus Hall, and essentially what happened was that a white foreman had beaten a Chinese worker to death in front of a bunch of Chinese witnesses. And so it should have been pretty much like a done deal as far as convicting him and sending him to jail. But what happened was the judge threw out the case because he had stated that the Chinese couldn't be trusted, that their testimonies weren't to be trusted. And so this court case will create a precedent and a new law that established that the Chinese were no longer allowed to provide a testimony in a court of law. So it didn't matter if a Chinese person is accused of a crime. It doesn't matter if a Chinese is a witness to a crime. They are no longer given the right to provide a testimony in court. So it's always going to be, in this case, like a white man's word or testimony against the Chinese. In 1862, the Anti-Coolie Act was passed. That's basically a shorter name of this law. The real name of the law is this long one above. It says, an act to protect free white labor against competition with Chinese coolie labor and to discourage the immigration of the Chinese into the state of California. So, in summary, just to give you a couple of things. First of all, the coolie is a derogatory name that was given to the Chinese. It's a lot like calling a Chinese, back then the Chinese workers, the Chinese railroad workers, the miners, they were known as coolies. It's like calling a Chinese person today like chink or a Japanese person Jap. It's a really bad word. So coolie is not a nice term. Anyway, this law, which was actually largely sponsored by the Workingmen's Party, and it was to protect jobs, white jobs, against Chinese workers. So what it did was, you can see here in the first 2 points, it first of all, if you were a Chinese worker, you were forced to pay a tax of $2.50 a month. The only exceptions were if you were a worker in some industries related to like agriculture, like coffee or corn or wheat or tea production and things like that. And then the second part is if you were a white business owner and if you hired a Chinese worker, particularly because the Chinese worker would be working for a lot less, then the government would force you to pay a $2.50 month tax on every Chinese worker you hired. So obviously, it would be too expensive to hire a Chinese worker, and if you still want to go with a Chinese worker, the worker or the white business owner would probably take out that $2.50 a month tax take that away from the actual Chinese worker's salary. And if you can see on the bottom, the typical monthly salary of a Chinese worker in the 1860s was anywhere from $3 to $4 per month. So in many cases, this tax either was equivalent to or even exceeded the monthly earnings for a Chinese worker. So it basically made a Chinese unemployable or pretty much broke. Another example of a law was called the Anti-Prostitution Act in 1870. This is actually another shortened term for a real long titled law. But what it was that when Chinese women started to arrive as well into the United States wanted to stop it because of the fear that they would come in, have children, then that meant that their kids were natural born citizens, and then they would be able to have all the rights granted to a citizen. So to prevent that from happening, they created this law, and they had presumed that the Chinese women were guilty and that they were coming to the United States specifically to become prostitutes. So these poor women, you can see in the picture, they didn't speak English, they didn't know what was going on, they just came to the United States looking for work, and then all of a sudden the United States government would tell them at the customs stations that they're obviously here in the United States for prostitution, and the only way you can come in was to show some kind of certificate that stated that you came to the United States for good moral reasons and that you were not a prostitute. So obviously, I mean, most of these women had no idea what they're talking about. They didn't have these kinds of certificates, and they were accused of being prostitutes, and automatically, and so as a result, these women were turned back and deported back to China. Strangely enough, prostitution was not illegal in the United States at this time, and anyone could be a prostitute. It was totally fine. There were brothels all across the United States, particularly in the West, but yet this law was really designed to sort of pick on the Chinese. At the same time, the same year, they passed the Naturalization Act of 1870, and what that was a law that stated that only whites and blacks can become naturalized as U.S. citizens. Naturalization is basically a process of where you have to stay in the United States for a number of years, you have to have work, you then have to take the citizenship test, and then eventually that allow you the opportunity to become a U.S. citizen. So they specifically stated it was only for blacks and whites, and that the Chinese and all other groups, particularly all other Asian groups, were no longer allowed the opportunity to become citizens. So all these like smaller, lesser laws are eventually going to brew over, and we're going to get the culmination of this big one known as the Exclusion Act of 1882. So what it did, a couple of things. First of all, it suspended all Chinese immigration for 10 years. That was the original goal. Later on, this law in 1892 will be extended for 10 more years. Okay, and then in 1902 it will be extended again, and eventually this law will be extended to be permanent. Women, children, and any unskilled laborers were also banned. Specifically, when we say unskilled laborers, we mean manual laborers. And the only people that were allowed, the exemptions under this law, were students, because they were here for a student visa to study in universities, and they weren't going to be here permanently. They were going to go back home to China. The second group were merchants, because the United States saw merchants as a group that they could be taxing. And then the third would be any government diplomats that represented the Chinese government. And that was pretty much it. Now, during the Exclusion Act, the Chinese, particularly the merchants, were able to find a loophole. And this is something I mentioned in the first reading assignment in Chinatown Revisited. And it had brought up this idea that early Chinese merchants saw a loophole, and so they were able to bring in their wives and their children despite the Exclusion Act. And what would happen is when they would put them down on their documents as being employees of their business. And so when they would arrive, they would tell the United States that these people were essential workers to their business, that they were mandatory and absolutely necessary to have to run their business. And because of that, that's why we started to see, particularly in Chinatown, that family life among Chinese Americans really began to center and focus on the family business. And that's the whole idea, is because that they came under this loophole under the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the Exclusion Act pretty much creates a chain reaction of all these other laws that will take place. Now the Exclusion Act basically will ban the Chinese from coming. So the flow of immigrants now from China has pretty much stopped, except for the small trickle of those that were under the exemptions. So then what starts to happen now is laws start to get passed in the United States to try and make the lives of the Chinese here pretty much miserable, so that we can get them to leave or to deport them. So what happened is in 1885, they start to implement segregation in all public locations. So Chinese students, for example, had to go to all Chinese schools. They could not go to schools with whites. Chinese could not hang out in public parks. They had to be in separate areas. They had to sit in separate places. They had to go to separate restrooms. They had to take separate forms of transportation. Everything was separated pretty much the same way we had treated African Americans. A weird act known as the Fish and Game Act in 1893 was passed, specifically banning the Chinese from being able to use fishing nets. And the strange thing is because the Chinese at this time also started to get employed as fishermen, and so they just wanted to make it where they couldn't find fish using nets. They wanted to make their lives miserable. So by 1904, the Exclusion Act of 1882 was finally decided to be made indefinite, and so it basically made the banning of the Chinese permanent. 2 years later, in 1906, we passed the Anti-Miscegenation Law, which made it illegal for any Chinese to marry a white person. It basically made any kind of mixed race marriage illegal. And then in 1913, the Alien Land Law was passed, which prevented all non-U.S. citizens from owning any type of land or property. So they couldn't own businesses, they couldn't own homes, they couldn't buy land. It basically, private property was only reserved for U.S. citizens. So this is what's happening here in the United States now. We've banned the Chinese. We're also trying to make their lives tough here in the United States. Eventually, this will all gradually start to change. And that's going to happen because of World War II, when the Japanese invade China.
In 1931, Japan had begun military operations aimed at seizing Manchuria. In 1932, a puppet state of Manchukuo was declared. The U.S., other great powers, and the League of Nations all protested, but none took any substantive retaliatory measures. Allied resistance to Japanese aggression strengthened in 1936, so Japan decided to strike. They launched a major invasion in July of 1937, sweeping aside nationalist armies and communist guerrilla forces. And by 1938, the Japanese controlled the wealthier portions of China and nearly half its population.
So basically, the Japanese eventually invading China to begin World War II, and then also later on when the Japanese invade the United States at Pearl Harbor and draws us into World War II, is what will reopen the doors of the United States to China. Because now we have a common enemy with China, and so it was urged to go back and repeal the Exclusion Act. And so by 1943, 2 years into World War II for the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt will eventually sign the repeal of the Exclusion Act of 1882. And that will effectively end the banning of the Chinese from coming, and they will start to arrive again in large numbers, especially those that were refugees that were trying to escape Japanese occupation. So things will dramatically improve, and when we hit the 60s, we're going to start getting into the Civil Rights era. In 1965, the Immigration Act of 65 was passed. Probably the biggest thing that it did was it reestablished a brand new annual immigration quota of 20,000 people per year. And what that meant was that every country around the world pretty much was allowed to send 20,000 people to immigrate here per year. So the number would be the same for all nations, and immigration was no longer going to be decided on the basis of race. So it essentially made things fair for all countries and brought about this whole new era of immigration, not only from China, but obviously from many other countries, particularly those of Southeast Asia, eventually Korea, and then of course our closest neighbor, Mexico. So here's a little video I'm going to show you guys to kind of talk about the end of this. It's going to kind of reflect on some of the big impacts that the Immigration Act of 65 had.
America has always been a land of immigrants. A century ago, most came from Europe. But in recent decades, changes in immigration law have opened the nation's doors to a new wave of immigrants who once again changed the face of America.
The 1965 Immigration Act completely transformed the Asian American community, and I would argue completely transforms America. It really changes the last important immigration act, which is the 1924 Immigration Act. The 1965 Immigration Act allocates an equal number for every country in the world, 20,000. It allows Asian immigrants to come in on the same basis as any other country in the world. So now they constitute about 4% of the American population. 10 to 12 million.
The 1965 Act said that family reunification was one of the top preferences. So if you had relatives in China, you could sponsor them under the 1965 Act. Now, my mother immigrated in 1941, before this happened. But one of the promises that she made when she left China to come to this country was that she would find a way to bring her two brothers from China to the United States when she got here. So after the 1965 Act passed, my mother immediately began going to classes and trying to learn English and get ready for passing the citizenship test so that she can become a U.S. citizen. So in 1972, she's able to send her brother from Hong Kong, sponsor him to come to the United States. And he brought his wife, and his wife had children here. And then later, when he became a citizen, he was able to send for the other brother from China after 1979, when that became possible.
Okay, so that ends the lesson. Thanks for paying attention, you guys. If you have any questions, make sure you guys have written those things out. And don't forget to ask me in class as soon as we meet. Okay, have a great rest of the day, and I will see you guys soon.